Dear friends, thank you for joining B'nai B'rith International and our Office for EU Affairs as we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The Holocaust, the extermination of 6 million Jews, and the murder of countless others, Roma, LGBTI, disabled, and political prisoners, was the worst crime ever perpetrated by human beings against their own. What began subtly ended catastrophically. This perfidious escalation directly impacted our organization. Already in 1933, the Nazi press reported that the government had placed B'nai B'rith under special political observation because of, quote, our effort to spread pacifism among the German people with their brotherhood of man ideas, close quote. Throughout the 30s, B'nai B'rith members across Europe were especially persecuted. We worked vigorously to try to get Jews out of Germany. Information that reached the organization from our German and European members was brought to the attention of the US State Department, the White House, and to the American public at large. Yet we could not extract any commitment to stop the Nazis' persecution. B'nai B'rith lodges were shut down in Germany in 1937. Indeed, between Kristallnacht, the 1938 November pogroms, and the May 1939 voyage of the damned on the ocean liner St. Louis, the indifference of fellow neighbors and the indifference of fellow nations became all too apparent. Well, 5 years later, the tide had turned. Cognizant of the unthinkable inhumanity that had been perpetrated, the Allied forces marched to liberate Europe. They liberated Majdanek and Dachau and Mauthausen and Buchenwald. They liberated Bergen-Belsen, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And on the 27th of January, 1945, they liberated Auschwitz. The inaction and indifference of the international community before the war and the formation of the UN after the war are the two sides of the same coin, a coin that shows us the importance of common purpose and common cause. The UN's founding was a response to the tragedy that produced the ashes of the Holocaust. The guiding principle of never again was not merely a sentiment, but a pillar onto which the international organization emerged. The Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after the Holocaust contributed greatly to what is today the European Union. In 1945, B'nai B'rith International witnessed and was present in San Francisco for the establishment of the UN, with the explicit aim of preventing such atrocities from ever happening again. The Council of Europe, too, came about after the Holocaust to ensure human rights and democracy could be upheld in post-war Europe. The world then understood the dangers of inaction, the dangers of indifference. We seem, unfortunately, to have lost that ability today. The year that has just concluded was a terribly difficult one. It was particularly so for the most vulnerable among us, especially for the elderly. Holocaust survivors, dwindling in numbers, have experienced what many have said to be the greatest struggles that they've endured since the war. And too many of them have perished due to the coronavirus. In this environment, extremism and hate have risen, and Jews, and indeed the Jewish state, have been the target of scapegoating and conspiracies. Well, in these times that test us, the importance of international cooperation has become ever more apparent. And so too has innovation, as we've been forced to find new ways to communicate, to stay connected, and indeed to engage in remembrance. That is why, with the historical and the current day in mind, on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we chose to focus on international cooperation and innovation as two essential pillars of remembrance. And we're honored that key international institutions have, in this spirit, joined us to recommit their efforts to discharge an abiding duty to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, to tackle anti-Semitism and hatred, and work to foster Jewish life, as you will see in the ensuing video messages. I want to take this opportunity to thank the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the Director General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Marija Pejčinović Burić, the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Her Excellency Ambassador Michaela Küchler, and the director of the OSCE ODIHR Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, Dr. Matteo Mecacci, for their messages of engagement and commitment. Thank you.
Dear friends, I'm honored to join B'nai B'rith on the occasion of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. For a German like me, it will always be something very special to speak on this occasion. I feel a deep responsibility. B'nai B'rith International never wavered in its mission to fight anti-Semitism and racism, to promote Jewish life, to stand by Israel, and to preserve the memory of the Holocaust. Today, I am here to tell you that Europe is with you in this endeavor, because anti-Semitism strikes at the heart of our values: humanity, religious freedom, equality. Anti-Semitism is a poison for our society. It is up to all of us to fight it, to prevent it, and to eradicate it. We in Europe are grateful that more than 75 years after the Holocaust, Jewish life is thriving again in schools and kindergartens, in synagogues and in trendy kosher restaurants, in the heart of our communities, in the middle of our everyday lives. That Jewish people feel at home in Europe makes us both incredibly grateful and humble. And it is a reminder for us. We must never remain silent when Jewish citizens in Europe are exposed to hatred and harassment again. But we also know that anti-Semitism is not buried deep in the past. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how quickly anti-Semitic conspiracy myth can spread. Disinformation and denials of fact are everywhere on the net, with anti-Semitic narratives circulating. In recent years, we have also witnessed a growing number of attacks on Jewish communities, like in the German city of Halle, where on the day of Yom Kippur in 2019, an attacker killed 2 people going about their normal life near a synagogue. Once again, in the heart of Europe, Jewish citizens had to fear for their lives. This act shocked our entire union, and it demonstrated that anti-Semitism did not end with the Shoah. We must fight it relentlessly, wherever it shows its ugly face. Today, this is more important than ever. The last survivors are passing away, and for many of our young people, the events of the Holocaust seem to belong to a faraway and distant past. Some have never even heard of it. Remembering the Shoah is our shared global responsibility. Holocaust survivors overcame their need to forget, and they spoke about the unspeakable to prevent history from repeating itself. It is impressive how they continue to reach out to young people despite their age. Their stories are a testimonial to the immeasurable strength of the Jewish people, their power of endurance, their will to survive. We must continue to tell their stories. I am therefore grateful to B'nai B'rith for leading this fight for remembrance and against denial and distortion with courage and determination. The European Union will contribute to this mission. This year we will present the first ever European strategy to combat anti-Semitism. Holocaust remembrance and education will be an important aspect in this strategy. And we will increase our funding for projects on Holocaust remembrance and education. And in addition, last week we have launched the campaign #ProtectTheFacts, which pushes back Holocaust distortion together with the United Nations, UNESCO, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We back up our fight against Holocaust distortion and denial by legislation too. With our Digital Services Act, we make clear that online platforms must take greater responsibility for their role in disseminating and promoting such material. Because where there are attempts to deny the Holocaust, it is Europe itself that is called into question. Dear friends, the duty to remember is for all of us. And it has to be passed down from generation to generation. Young people need to know the facts. They are particularly exposed to Holocaust distortion on the net. We need to teach them about the Holocaust and the fragile nature of human societies. Because it is the young who in future will have to keep our solemn promise. Never forget.
Nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui à travers le monde en cette journée retenue par les Nations Unies pour la mémoire des victimes de la Shoah. Cette journée du 27 janvier qui vit, il y a 76 ans jour pour jour, les troupes soviétiques pénétraient dans le camp d'Auschwitz-Birkenau. Et en ce jour, nous sommes tous appelés à nos responsabilités, celle de la mémoire de ce qui fut hier et celle d'ici et de maintenant. Plus que jamais, il nous faut donc agir et lutter contre l'amnésie, la distorsion des faits, ne pas céder de terrain aux falsificateurs et aux démagogues, le faire à travers les forces puissantes de la mémoire et de l'éducation. Non seulement pour aujourd'hui pleurer les morts, mais aussi pour avertir les vivants, pour reprendre les mots du regretté Samuel Pisar, qui fut notre envoyé spécial sur ce sujet. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, fighting oblivion, this is UNESCO's aim and mission in supporting Holocaust research, commemoration, and education. This mission is all the more essential today, and with the involvement of our partners, we have stepped up our actions to address teachers and pupils, first of all. Thanks to the financial support of Canada, we will soon be holding a new edition of the International Conference on Education and the Holocaust, training educators across the globe in cooperation with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. This year, we've also incorporated new content for teachers, trainers, and school directors on addressing anti-Semitism in schools as a result of our partnership with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and University College London, whom I thank. All of our resources on preventing anti-Semitism will soon be accessible on the website developed by the UNESCO chair at the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation. But we're also addressing governments to fight all attempts to deny or distort facts, falsify the past, or excuse the inexcusable. With the European Commission, we have launched a campaign to debunk online hate speech and conspiracy theories, particularly anti-Semitic statements. Now, building on this initiative, we are developing a guide for educators to help young people critically assess online content. In partnership with the United Nations, the University of Oxford, and the World Jewish Congress, we have launched a global study to map the sources and channels of Holocaust distortion and denial on social media and help educators respond to it more effectively. And also, with the World Jewish Congress, we have developed the website aboutholocaust.org to provide reliable and easily accessible information on the genocide of the Jewish people. It is now available in 19 languages. And I'm pleased to announce today that as a result of a good collaboration with Facebook, the social media platform will, as of today, connect people with the new website at the top of relevant search results so the public is better informed online. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations and UNESCO were built on the ashes of the Second World War so that the international community could prevent these horrors from ever being repeated. Raymond Aron wrote in 1947, "Perhaps the supreme virtue would be to look in humanity in the face without losing faith in humans." This truth is even more evident in the unstable and uncertain global context we're currently living in, which could either be fertile ground for all forms of regression or an opportunity to commit to a new renaissance, educational, scientific, and cultural. I thank you. «
76 ans se sont écoulés depuis la libération d'Auschwitz-Birkenau. Depuis, beaucoup de choses ont changé en Europe. Nos sociétés ont évolué, très souvent pour le meilleur. Nous sommes en meilleure santé, mieux éduqués et avec un meilleur niveau de vie. Nous avons pris conscience des vieux préjugés et nous les combattons. Et puis, les droits de l'homme, la démocratie et l'état de droit ont été fermement établis et consolidés, notamment par le Conseil de l'Europe, fondé au sortir de la Seconde Guerre mondiale et conçu pour donner une force juridique aux besoins ressentis du « plus jamais ça ». Nous avons parcouru tant de chemins qu'il est facile de se laisser aller à la complaisance, que les réalités crues du Holocauste pourraient commencer à s'estomper, que les leçons si durement apprises pourraient peu à peu sombrer dans l'oubli. Nous ne pouvons pas le permettre. Le souvenir et la mémoire active resteront à jamais essentiels pour que les horreurs de la Shoah ne se reproduisent plus. Plus encore, cette conscience est nécessaire pour s'assurer que les formes anodines de discrimination et d'hostilité soient perçues et ne restent pas sans réponse. C'est une fin en soi, mais c'est aussi un moyen d'empêcher l'escalade. Nous en sommes toujours là avec l'antisémitisme. On this day, we think of the 6 million Jews who were murdered and the generations lost. Atrocity of that kind and scale are not a feature of life in Europe today. But we live in a time of uncertainty where a shrill and intolerant tone too often breaks through, and where there has been an increase in the incidence of anti-Semitic words and attacks. The 2019 murder of 2 people in Halle, Germany, on Yom Kippur, and for which the killer was sentenced just last month, is a case in point. It is for that reason that I have recently appointed a special representative on anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, and other forms of religious intolerance and hate crimes. By this, we will be further supporting the development of the Council of Europe's comprehensive response to these phenomena so that we are better placed to tackle them. A new and important part of that response is the Committee of Ministers' current work on a recommendation on passing on remembrance of the Holocaust and preventing crimes against humanity, which I hope will be adopted in the near future. This is just one of many initiatives that we have undertaken on this vital and foundational challenge. But the Council of Europe is also active in combating hatred and discrimination against other minority groups who were persecuted by Nazis and who perished during the Holocaust. Among them were Roma and Sinti, LGBTI people, and those with disabilities. In recent months, some of these communities have faced acts of hatred related in the context of COVID-19. A further reminder that prejudice can seep up through the cracks and fissures that appear during times of stress and complexity. and a further call to action for all of us to confront discrimination. Every year on this day, we search for words that will convey the terror of the Holocaust. But the words fail us. They cannot capture the suffering and loss. Our responsibility now is to ensure that we do not fail those who lost their lives and those who have come after. That we remember and that we act to preserve memory, to ensure dignity, and to build societies in which people live in the safety and security that each of us deserves.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real privilege and an honor for me to address all of you on behalf of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. At the outset, I would like to thank B'nai B'rith International for organizing this important event, which highlights the need for innovation and collaboration in combating anti-Semitism through Holocaust remembrance and education. These are two themes which are key for our office in our efforts to support OSCE participating states in countering anti-Semitism. A word that constantly remembers the Holocaust through both commemoration and education is one in which we hope the horrors of the past will never be repeated. The Holocaust provides the ultimate lessons on the horrific consequences of toxic and harmful prejudices and hate when we fail to counter intolerance and discrimination from the very beginning. And yet, we have seen how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing discrimination and intolerance, and fueled instances of incitement to hostility or violence, conspiracy theories, and scapegoating. We are now reminded yet again that anti-Semitism is a pernicious form of hatred that we cannot confine to a distant and painful past. Anti-Semitism continues to transform over time, finding new and fertile ground to flourish across the OSCE region, most notably now in the digital space. And despite their many positive contributions, digital technologies have also facilitated the global and rapid spread of conspiracy theories and age-old disinformation about Jews on social media. Policies and practice have failed so far to keep up and contain the spread. And as the organizers of this conference rightly identified, such negative trends can only be counteracted through innovation and collaboration. During this challenging time, ODIHR continues its search for creative solutions, for example, by integrating digital technologies into our work and developing tools tailored to the interests and sensitivities of the youth. They, after all, are the most digitally literate of all age groups. One great example of such innovation are our tools on addressing anti-Semitism through education. These include strategies for dealing with online hatred and which aim to increase knowledge about Jews and Judaism and break down anti-Semitic prejudice both off and online. Ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced that a collaborative approach is vital to combat anti-Semitism, but we need to intensify these efforts. With its strong mandate to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, ODIHR will continue to bring together a diverse gathering of governments and civil society organizations to build trust and have a real impact. I therefore very much look forward to working closely together, not only in the field of Holocaust remembrance, but also to find innovative means of combating anti-Semitism and hate crimes. In this way, we'll make our society more secure for everyone in the years ahead. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you all a fruitful and productive discussion today. Thank you.
"76 years ago, on the 27th of January 1945, Soviet troops entered the Auschwitz camp complex, liberating the 7,000 prisoners that they found there. Today, we remember and honor the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, those who resisted the Nazis and those who protected or rescued their persecuted fellow human beings. Just days prior to the 27th of January, nearly 60,000 prisoners were forced to march for days under brutal conditions in freezing temperatures. They marched through Europe's cities and villages westward to Buchenwald, to Flossenbürg, to Dachau, to Sachsenhausen and other camps. As many as 15,000 died as a result. Similar forced marches took place all over Nazi Germany, and these would continue right up to the end of the war and Germany's unconditional surrender. These forced marches, which survivors would call the death marches, were being done in part because the Nazis did not want prisoners to fall into the hands of Allied forces alive. They did not want them to tell their stories, to testify. That is, they wanted to destroy the evidence. Today, we know that the evidence could not be destroyed. We know that, against all odds, many did tell their stories. On the occasion of the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we are reminded of the importance of listening to the evidence, to the facts, to this history. Remembrance plays a critical role in fighting the persistent forces of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion. This is because remembrance ties us fundamentally to the facts, to what took place, and the people it affected. When we remember, when we strive to reflect upon this suffering, we understand that as unimaginable as it is just as undeniable. But today we do so aware that Holocaust remembrance is at a critical juncture. Fewer and fewer survivors and eyewitnesses are with us to continue to share their testimony. We must listen to them and preserve their stories and their message with great care. And we must look after them in these difficult times. The pandemic has hit survivors very hard. They are in the most vulnerable age group. They suddenly had to isolate from families, friends, communities. Daily help became hard to find. Worst of all, the sudden climate of all-pervasive threat brought back the traumata, the anxieties, the sleepless nights. Many fear that they may lose their homes, their sanctuaries. I was glad that the Jewish Claims Conference and the German government together found ways and means to improve the support for home care and hardship cases. The pandemic has had another big impact. Remembrance has to go digital. While nothing can replace the immediacy of a story told in person, it is wonderful that we have found creative ways of remembering. This will also help us to preserve testimonies of survivors over time. At the same time, Holocaust denial and distortion are gaining traction, fanning the flames of hate and allowing anti-Semitism to inch towards the mainstream. We have just seen unashamed anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial amongst the rioting mob in the capital. T-shirts encrypted, Camp Auschwitz. These are not just words. As survivor Max Eisen said, it started with words and it ended in terrible places. Allowing distortion invites the erosion of our understanding of the Holocaust and its significance. It helps sustain an environment in which Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, conspiracy myths, and dangerous forms of nationalism can thrive. For this reason, the German presidency of the IHRA has established a global task force against Holocaust distortion to identify and promote strategies for countering this phenomenon. Earlier this month, the IHRA published recommendations to strengthen awareness of distortion and how to address it. In order to counter Holocaust distortion effectively, action is needed on various levels, involving many different groups, from professionals to policymakers to journalists and society as a whole. I would therefore like to thank the the B'nai B'rith International for organizing today's commemoration event and for discussing renewed commitment through innovation and collaboration. As we reflect upon this history and its enduring effects, we uphold the terrible truths of the Holocaust against those who deny it. As individuals and as societies, we must carry on with this important work. Today, we are reminded to strive for a world that listens to the evidence, for a world that remembers the Holocaust, for a world without genocide.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Alina Brickman. I am the Director of EU Affairs of B'nai B'rith International. We are really grateful to the heads of major international institutions that we have just heard from for voicing their commitment and that of the bodies that they represent to remembrance and to safeguarding Jewish life today. We will have an opportunity now to speak in greater detail with the focal points in these institutions about what they are doing to ensure that Holocaust remembrance is elevated and that Jewish communities are protected today. Before my colleague Ilan introduces you to our guest, I'd like to just take a moment and sort of set the intention of our discussion. As our keynote speakers have echoed, we've been through a testing year. It's been a year that has put the importance of a united and engaged international community at the center, but also one that has reminded us, as the Holocaust survivor Tom Lantos often said, that the veneer of civilization is paper thin. And in fact, for the Jewish community, it's been distressing to see just how quick large swaths of the population reverted to conspiracy theories, to scapegoating, and really to see a tangible rise in extremism. So as we speak about learning about the Holocaust and learning the lessons of the Holocaust, it's important to remember just how foundational this has been to the creation of an international community as we know it today. It's an international community that recognizes precisely that the veneer of civilization is paper thin, and as well as Tom Lantos continued, that we are its guardians and that we can never rest. So particularly within the context of this year, on this first panel, we thought it important to focus on how international bodies are keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive today, the concrete work they are doing, and how that ties into tackling challenges posed by anti-Semitism and hate today. And we also hope to spotlight some of the great collaborative work that these institutions have engaged in recent time. So let us go to that now and meet our panelists. Ilan, I'm passing over to you.
Thank you, Alina. Hello, everyone, also from my side. My name is Ilan Selby, and I'm the EU Affairs Officer of B'nai B'rith International. And today, as Alina alluded to, we're very pleased to be joined by our panelists. Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Commissioner's Coordinator for Combating Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life. She's the first person to ever occupy this role and has been leading this effort since December 2015, channeling the voices of Jewish civil society within the EU. Karel Frakapan, Programme Specialist in UNESCO's Division for Peace and Sustainable Development in the section of Global Citizenship and Peace Education, where he is the focal point for Holocaust education, also joins us today. Christy Edwards, the Deputy Head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. This is the branch of ODIHR tasked with raising awareness about anti-Semitism and its impact and elevating Holocaust remembrance in education. And last but not least, Daniel Hultgen, who took on in November the role of Special Representative on anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim and other forms of religious intolerance and hate crimes of the Council of Europe, where he also serves as spokesperson. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'll pass back to Alina so we can get started.
Right. So to begin with, I'd just like to perhaps open the floor and hear from each of you about how Holocaust remembrance is conceptualized within your institutions, both in terms of the broad role it plays with regards to the very fundamental kind of guiding mission of your 4 institutions, but also in terms of the actual in practice reality of how that plays out, which is to say, what projects are you overseeing? What commitments have member states made? What initiatives are you supporting? And so on and so forth. So Katharina, allow me to start with you, and then we'll go through to Karel, Christy, and Daniel.
Yes, hello. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to look in particular on how the European Commission has been commemorating the Holocaust and also how it is anchored in our institutions. We often say that the European Union was founded on the ashes of the Holocaust and on World War II, and I believe this remains very true. Therefore, the focus on Holocaust remembrance has been there for many years, in fact, through our funding, but also for example, more recently, since 2008, in legislation, the framework decision on racism and xenophobia, which criminalizes Holocaust denial, trivialization, and condoning the Holocaust. So we have a very strong legal basis there for concrete action, which I believe when we look at the internet today has become even more relevant, because in that same piece of legislation, hate speech is also criminalized. So this aspect has been very important as we look also now at Holocaust distortion, because I believe what also Michaela Küchler said is very important. The outright Holocaust denial is ostracized across society in most areas, but Holocaust distortion, questioning the numbers, holding the Jews responsible, these kind of things are much more subtle, not necessarily always illegal, but very harmful. And so to ensure, and I think now we have a big challenge with regards to creating new forms of remembrance. And in fact, because we are all confined to the digital world at the moment for our communications, I believe that this year has been pivotal with regards to really finding new ways. I mean, we were forced to do that. I had 2 conversations with Holocaust survivors online. They can, in that format, reach young people much easier and wider than this would have been the case before. Still, we know that unfortunately they have been hit also disproportionately by COVID. So that they are not going to be with us for much longer. So we will have to find other ways also how we can keep their testimony and make sure that future generations know not only about the Holocaust, but how it came about, and that it was anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, and what that means if we see anti-Semitism again today. So having said that, it's been really important for the Commission, and for example, one very concrete project that we have been financing since 2010 is the European Holocaust Remembrance Infrastructure. It's a platform where memorial sites and institutions that research on the Holocaust connect all across Europe and with Yad Vashem and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to ensure that their research is open for each other and create synergies. And in that project, they have also, for example, digitalized a lot of archives, so to make them available, for example, also for researchers that might be in an environment where there is Holocaust distortion ongoing, and maybe even to some extent state policy. So this has been very important to us, but then we have also other funding projects, for example, the Memorial de la Shoah, the Auschwitz Memorial, the educational center there has been financed by EU money. We have also a project now with regards to categorizing and finding looted art, which also is, of course, related to the Holocaust. So there are different projects going on, and down to concrete remembrance events and exhibitions, for example. I think this is so much from my side for a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina. And I particularly take note of the legal framework, which I think amongst the institutions present, the EU is the one that actually has this competence. So I think that's important to note. I'm glad we will be hearing
maybe one aspect. Maybe one aspect to that, the reason why it is specifically the Holocaust that was criminalized, the denial of the Holocaust, is because the denial of the Holocaust today still is fueled by and creates anti-Semitism. It's important to understand that this was the reasoning behind this specific legislation in 2008.
Thank you for that note, and I look forward in the rest of the discussion to also speak about how remembrance connects to what we are trying to tackle today. Thank you, Katharina. So let me move now to Karel and the work UNESCO is doing.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much to the B'nai B'rith for inviting me, and thanks for your constant cooperation with UNESCO. It's really a pleasure to be here today with colleagues and with friends. UNESCO, you should know, is the UN agency with a specific mandate to educate about the Holocaust. This is the agency of the United Nations that deals with education, culture, and in that respect, we do have a particular mandate to work with ministries of education really in terms of formal education to educate about the Holocaust. This is a global mandate. That is based on a UN General Assembly resolution from 2005 on remembrance of the Holocaust, and a resolution from UNESCO General Conference from 2007 entitled also Remembrance of the Holocaust. And that's after these resolutions that both organizations have started developing initiatives relating to Holocaust remembrance. I think important to note that this was recorded recently in 2019, in fact, in the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, which mentions clearly the importance of dealing with violent pasts through education, including the Holocaust. So that's another moment where the importance of teaching about the Holocaust, remembering the Holocaust, is reminded in UN official texts. So basically, UNESCO's work in the field is part of the organization's work on global citizenship education. That is to say, it very, very shortly, a broad UN umbrella for our work on peace and human rights education. So working in a global UN context, the overall idea is to emphasize the fact that educating about the Holocaust, besides imparting historical knowledge about the history of the Jewish people at that time, we'll help highlight the dynamics, the causes, the consequences of this particular case of genocide, of course, and beyond that, it highlights important warning signs for the prevention of genocide that are universally valid. So we emphasize in this context, there's a UN and global context, the importance of teaching about the Holocaust to highlight the fragility of democratic institutions, to underscore the dangers of prejudice, in particular anti-Semitism, naturally, and how divisive ideologies, when not confronted, can permeate a society. And of course, in our context, it's particularly important to draw attention, as you've all said, actually, to the international norms and institutions that were developed as a result of crimes perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. All these norms and institutions that nowadays protect human rights and prevent, or do not prevent well, atrocity crimes. So for us, it's dealing with the Holocaust also because it helps us draw important lessons in terms of atrocity prevention. So how do we do that? We develop policy guidelines, so guidelines for policymakers. We also do some research and develop guidelines for educators on Holocaust education in particular, as this education becomes more widespread around the globe. But also, as Katharina was mentioning, as it's changing as generations pass and as the contexts are evolving. So the idea for us is not only to do more education about the Holocaust, but also to do better education about the Holocaust. What we do here in that respect is to try to develop local capacities and support national initiatives, basically in all parts of the globe, on how to teach about the Holocaust and genocide. And we do it in particular in partnership with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, especially in countries that are struggling with very violent pasts, also in countries of Europe, where the history of the Holocaust may have remained particularly contentious. And so we've done so in about 20 countries in the past years, and we will intensify that work in 2021. I want to mention also, to answer your question, that in addition to that work on Holocaust education, UNESCO has developed a distinct specific program on addressing contemporary anti-Semitism through education. So it's two different programs, though obviously related. Through that program, we do a lot of advocacy, which means that UNESCO really is trying to raise awareness about the realities of anti-Semitism as it manifests itself today and as it affects the lives of Jewish communities today and the societies in which it spreads. So what we want to do is to make sure that anti-Semitism is understood for what it is, in its contemporary guises, in its contemporary forms, and as a global issue. And that is an important point. And of course, from a United Nations perspective, this is important. That's why the issue was an object of an event that we organized in 2018 during the General Assembly of the United Nations to really mobilize member states behind the need to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism as such. I will just finish this introduction by saying that we also, in the field of dealing with anti-Semitism, are providing education stakeholders with more and with new tools. And this is a work that we're doing in partnership with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Christy will tell you more about it, maybe. And in that respect, we have developed a guide for policymakers a couple of years ago. And we just published a curriculum for teacher training institutions. And the idea here is really to help educators understand the problem as it manifests itself today, understand that phenomenon, and to develop effective pedagogies to prevent through education, but also to be able to react when they are confronted to manifestations of anti-Semitism in educational environments. And of course, one of the issues behind this is how do you teach about anti-Semitism, about the history of anti-Semitism and about the history of the Jewish people. And what we do with these materials, and something that we started in 2019 also with ODIHR, is to do capacity building for ministries of education. And I will maybe tell you a bit more about it a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Karel, and thank you for highlighting very clearly kind of the niche and the space that UNESCO is occupying in this discussion. We heard from Katharina more the legal perspective, the commemorative perspective, and as well the capacity building for civil society. From you, we're hearing about the educational and prevention aspect, as well as the work with policymakers. So I'm sure Christy will now tie into what Karel was mentioning about the work you're doing together, but also more broadly tell us a little bit about the work ODIHR is doing in this regard.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alina, and thanks to B'nai B'rith for inviting me to speak. And as Karel said, it's so nice to see so many familiar faces and old friends, particularly since we haven't seen each other in person in so long. So maybe just a little bit on our history and our mandate. The commitment to remembrance goes back to the very beginning of the OSCE, and the word remembrance was first used in the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which of course is the founding document of the OSCE. And the participating states then agreed to promote remembrance of and education about the tragedy of the Holocaust as early as 2004. And in 2014, the OSCE held a high-level commemorative event to mark the 10th anniversary of the Berlin Declaration on Anti-Semitism, and it highlighted the problems of Holocaust denial and distortion. And so as a result of that meeting, we were specifically tasked by the 57 OSCE participating states to facilitate cooperation between governmental officials and civil society on issues related to Holocaust remembrance. And we do take this very seriously. So while not the primary focus of my department, it is Holocaust remembrance is very key for our office in our sustained and long-standing efforts to support the OSCE participating states in countering anti-Semitism. So in practice, this looks a couple different ways. To mark the occasion of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, ODIHR publishes a biannual publication on Holocaust Memorial Days, an overview of remembrance and education in the OSCE region. And this document, or this publication, provides information on when, where, and how OSCE participating states commemorate and study the Holocaust, as well as the extermination persecution of Roma and Sinti peoples. And so the aim with this publication is to encourage governments to draw on each other's good practices and, of course, enhance their own activities in this area. ODIHR has also been collecting information on these efforts since 2008. So we've got quite a few of these publications that have been released since then. The way we do this is that we systematically collect this information from the participating states through an online questionnaire. We developed this questionnaire in consultation with experts in the field of Holocaust commemoration, and also with feedback from the participating states themselves. And the report covers four main areas: commemoration, education and research, memorial sites, and good practices. The section on commemoration provides information on when commemorative events are held, which groups are commemorated, and whether the events are established officially. The one on education and research provides details on research into the Holocaust, educational activities, teacher training, and the information included in textbooks and extracurricular activities. The chapter on memorial sites also provides information on which groups are commemorated, as well as how the sites are funded. And this term of memorial sites does not encompass concentration, labor, and transition camps, but only refers to monuments, commemorative plaques, etc. And then finally, the good practices chapter provides ideas and initiatives for other participating states to consider using in their Holocaust commemoration and education activities. And these efforts, of course, are very much intertwined with education, and ODIHR, of course, has developed quite a number of materials, as Carol mentioned, which we've developed jointly with UNESCO. In May 2018, we co-published the Addressing Anti-Semitism Through Education Guidelines for Policymakers, which also includes guidance on education, educating students about the Holocaust. In December of 2019, ODIHR published a set of 10 related teaching aids for use in the classroom, which include 2 dealing directly with Holocaust education. And as Carol also mentioned, we, with the support of University College London Centre for Holocaust Education, we released last year a 4-volume publication on addressing anti-Semitism in schools, a training curricula, which is intended for trainers to assist teachers and school directors in preventing and responding to anti-Semitism, specifically for primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, vocational school teachers, and school directors. I finally wanted to just note that ODIHR also gathers information on hate crime and incidents committed in OSCE participating states that's published every year in our annual hate crime reports. And one type of hate crime that we regularly identify in these reports is vandalism directed against Holocaust memorials in participating states, as well as the use of insults and threats related to the Holocaust during attacks on individuals, as these can be a sign of the anti-Semitic bias of these hate crimes. And then finally, I wanted to just note that ODIHR cooperates with state institutions and civil society to share good practices on addressing anti-Semitism and promoting Holocaust education, including by translating its educational materials and holding train-the-trainer events and other training events that Carol's already mentioned. So I won't go into too much detail there. But I'll turn it back over. I know we've got some other topics to discuss and other panelists to hear from too.
Thank you very much, Christy, for that overview. And I can attest to the usefulness of the publication and having a synthesized place where you can keep track of how participating states are actually commemorating the Holocaust. And as well for highlighting the monitoring aspect. In my interactions with the ODIHR monitoring exercises, it's always incredibly interesting to see the gap between what member states are reporting, what participating states are reporting, and what civil society is reporting. So I think that's a really important tool right there. So let me come now to Daniel. Tell us a little bit about what the Council of Europe is doing in this area, and while your portfolio is still rather fresh, how you will be dealing with this topic moving forward. How do you anticipate that your portfolio will take remembrance as part of the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much, Alina, and good afternoon to you all. Can you hear me? Good. That's the first part already solved. You can hear me. And good afternoon from Strasbourg, France, where we're based and where I've started my new mandate. I don't know if you can see the window in the corner of my office, but that looks out to the forecourt of the Council of Europe. And as you approach the main building of the Council of Europe, you will see a commemorative stone and a plaque to remember the victims of the Holocaust. And indeed, this is where the leaders of the Council of Europe always on the 27th of January gather to pay tribute. And they are joined by the ambassador of Israel to the international organizations in France, but they are also joined by representatives of the Roma and LGBTI communities. So in a way, commemoration and remembrance is part of our DNA because as the first international organization, European international organization, which was founded after the Second World War, we were established to rebuild Europe on the basis of human rights and intended to really ensure that the Holocaust and the total breakdown of human rights would never, ever happen again. So we have basically three approaches to remembrance and fighting anti-Semitism. I will focus on the first, but the three are remembrance, education, and monitoring of racism, but also of anti-Semitism in particular. Now, the most important initiative this year is the fact that 47 member states, which include the 27 of the European Union, will hopefully very soon adopt a recommendation which is called Passing on Remembrance of the Holocaust and Preventing Crimes Against Humanity. The purpose of this recommendation is to promote the passing on of history and remembrance in our member states, and most importantly, to develop a shared approach to teaching and learning about the Holocaust. This also includes, as was perhaps mentioned earlier, the role of places of remembrance, such as Jewish cemeteries. The recommendation emphasizes the exceptional nature of the destruction of the entire European Jewish community, and it condemns the denialist and revisionist tendencies which are seeking to distort remembrance and the Holocaust, and which are, of course, incompatible with the values of the Council of Europe. So this is actually quite significant because of the range of membership that we have, which also obviously includes some countries which for example, have not yet been able to adopt the IHRA recommendation or IHRA definition on Holocaust. But it shows that there is a common ground, a large common ground, and it should enable us to start new projects, innovative projects to pass on remembrance. Of course, I have other priorities as special representatives, not only in the area of education, but I can touch on those later on. So that is really the most important development, and it will be noticed once it's adopted, and I will obviously keep you posted of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks to all our panelists for their answers. You've all mentioned some very important challenges that as Jewish organizations, as international institutions, and as society at large are facing, such as the online space. Katharina, you spoke about the particularly pernicious effects that Holocaust distortion has, and trivialization as well. I'd like to perhaps take a moment to invite you to elaborate on these and other difficulties in remembrance work, and hear from all our panelists about some of the constructive steps that you've taken to overcome them. Christy, perhaps we can start with you, as both you and Director Mecacci spoke about the challenges posed by the online space. To elaborate on that and on sort of remedies you've implied in this area, as well as around some of the other issues mentioned.
Sure, sorry, my unmute button was finicky there. Yes, of course. So there's been a couple of challenges that we've certainly noticed over the last year or so. One challenge I would say is not new. It's more of a procedural nature, which is the challenge of gathering data from governments on Holocaust remembrance. Not all governments, of course, collect this information or have it centralized. So the information that we are able to share publicly depends on how complete the information that we get from the participating states. And we don't have the resources to verify the accuracy of the information we're given, so we do rely on them to provide this information to us. But as you mentioned, particularly with the challenge of misinformation and distortion on the internet, a broader challenge is the growing lack of knowledge and awareness, as well as resistance to lessons about and from the Holocaust, and particularly some of the online conspiracies and misinformation that's floating around out there. And these, of course, are particularly acute amongst young people. So in order to overcome these challenges, I would say on the first aspect, we are now in the process of revisiting and revising the methodology and collecting data related to Holocaust remembrance, and of course hoping that this will then make the information and of course usefulness of this publication even more of a benefit to the actors who are using this publication. Secondly, our educational tools do contain a lot of very practical strategies on how to overcome these challenges, so that remembrance and education efforts not only counter, but also don't inadvertently fuel anti-Semitism. Certainly the Holocaust remembrance is very key as part of our efforts on countering anti-Semitism, but we really stress that remembrance is only a starting point, and it must be accompanied by action to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism. So one strand is to deal with root causes. How can we help to dispel anti-Semitic notions by addressing those who hold them? And I think that our teacher aids are of really great value here. They not only explore how to carefully deal with the difficult emotions which accompany efforts of remembrance and education, but they also contain a lot of strategies on how to sensitize students to the dangers of stereotypes and prejudice, and to confront learners with the possible consequences of anti-Semitism, intolerance, and racism. And of course, these strategies can easily be transposed outside the classroom. For example, one of our teacher aids contains strategies for teachers to spend some time with the class looking at how Jews took part in different parts of life in their town, in their country, or in Europe throughout the ages, both before the Holocaust and after it. So developing an understanding of what the Jewish presence in their community has meant for Europe's development over hundreds of years can really help students understand and appreciate the significance of the loss of 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population in the 20th century. And it also suggests the use of primary sources, firsthand accounts of an event, which can be used to drive home the reality of the Holocaust. These include photographs, interviews, or personal narratives. The second strand is dealing with the unfortunate consequences of anti-Semitism. So to ensure better regulation of social media, facilitate the cooperation of governments and Jewish communities on matters of security and hate crime reporting, and building strong civil society coalitions. And so this is where ODIHR's convening power comes in. We can bring together diverse actors across divides to build confidence so that they can start working together on these issues and to be more successful than they ever would if they were to work on these issues alone. We've definitely long recognized that addressing anti-Semitism requires a collaborative and comprehensive approach involving not only states, but all other relevant actors, such as civil society organizations, religious or belief communities, other minority communities, national human rights institutions, academia, educational professionals, other IGOs, the media, and private companies. So it's really now, I think, the time to intensify these efforts, particularly as we're seeing significant misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories that are really proliferating. As we often say, these are not new issues. We're seeing some of the same recycled forms come back again, and just used in new and different ways. So it's definitely an opportunity for us all to work together and to pool our resources in order to address these issues.
Thank you, Christy. And absolutely, as you mentioned, there's a real need to focus on the Jewish contribution to Europe in a positive sense, and not only talking about it in terms of Jews and anti-Semitism, but really focus on Jewish contributions to Europe. So thank you for your response. And touching on some of the same themes, Katharina, let me come to you now. The EU's new digital legislation, indeed as President von der Leyen referred to in her opening address, including the Digital Services Act, the Democracy Action Plan, etc., aimed at promoting equality, pluralism, as well as tackling disinformation, having been some of the major developments speaking to broader challenges faced by the EU. Are these steps helpful in impacting Holocaust memory in EU member states? And what other initiatives might you wish to highlight on this front?
Yes, I think actually, if we look at what we are facing at the moment, there are, I think, probably 4 challenges that we see directly related with regards to Holocaust remembrance. One is generally the online world and the way Holocaust denial and distortion needs to be addressed. Of course, I mean, Holocaust denial, as I said before, is illegal, and what is illegal offline is illegal online. So there we really expect the platforms to act in particular when these things are being flagged to them. But as we know, some of them have also taken proactive measures to actually now use their own algorithms to detect this illegal content. That is one aspect when it comes to illegal hate speech. And then with regards to Holocaust distortion, I think we need a much more subtle approach, which means that takedown is not necessarily an option, because it actually might fuel the conspiracy that is behind it. And it's very important to debunk this distortion. And we, together with UNESCO and the IHRA and the UN, now for Holocaust Remembrance Day, launched a campaign which is called Protect the Facts. There's a very good website behind it, which is called Against Holocaust Distortion in One Word.org, where you can find facts about the Holocaust, but also how it is being distorted. And so it's a campaign with different GIFs and different pictures and statements and so on that is now being launched and will be ongoing throughout the year, because we really feel that online, especially when it comes to young people, they don't even realize that there is a distortion, because they don't know the facts anymore. I mean, 20% of young people have never heard of Auschwitz, of the name Auschwitz. Yeah, so this is I think a real challenge. And as we know, the acceleration that has been going on with hatred and anti-Semitism, racism through the net, I think it is really important to tackle this online challenge. I believe personally, connected to the digital world is also, and I make a bit of promotion for a project that the Arolsen archives are currently doing, and where we thought it was useful to get commission staff also involved. It's a crowdsourcing project where the 30 million documents that are in the Arolsen archives that were collected directly after the war are being digitalized. And you as an individual, you log on to Every Name Counts and you transcribe what you see on the fiche into a digital fiche. And I think that this, for example, is very meaningful, because it's not only, you know, that you help out on digitalization for an archive. You remember the name of a person, you remember the fate of that person, and somehow connect really with the past. So I think these kind of projects are very meaningful, because they give us a possibility to do something meaningful in our limited ways, but really help that Holocaust research, Holocaust commemoration, and also access for descendants of these people possibly will be possible to the documents. So that, I think, is a positive example of how we can use now the digital world. Funding always also has been an issue, and because we see that Holocaust distortion, denial, but also that the remembrance becomes so much more important, and that we need to develop these new forms. We have for next year tripled the funding for remembrance projects, broadly speaking, in order to ensure that we can engage through projects in a direct way and very much more targeted. But you mentioned beforehand also cemeteries as a place of remembrance in a way, and because in Eastern Europe there are very small Jewish communities left because of the Holocaust, we have started to finance a pilot project that maps the cemeteries in Central and Eastern Europe, including also Ukraine, to ensure that we at least know the locations of where they were. Because had there been Jewish communities, they would have taken care of these cemeteries. But as they are no longer, we think that this is also a responsibility of showing making the people that live there now and the tourists that might come aware of the Jewish life that once was there. And to round up from our side, we will now next year, this year, it's already 2021, we will adopt the first ever strategy against anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, so the two together, in order to have a really holistic approach, which of course, with the three pillars, anti-Semitism, Jewish life, and Holocaust remembrance and education, this will be one of the three central pillars and important pillars to ensure that now that we are at a real change with regards to the victims passing away, that we really, within the next 10 years, we will have to find these new ways. And I think it will be one of our key challenges in Europe. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katharina, indeed, for mentioning these areas that we spoke about. Let me pick up on the campaign you mentioned, #ProtectTheFacts, and I'll take that to Carol, if I may. Noting as well the guide for policymakers developed by UNESCO in partnership with the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, recognising and countering Holocaust distortion. Perhaps you could elaborate on these two initiatives, the challenges that they came to meet and how you anticipate their impact being.
Thank you, Leon. I just want to say, first of all, that the publication you mentioned is not a publication of UNESCO, but it's a publication of the IHRA in partnership with UNESCO. UNESCO being an international permanent partner to the IHRA. And we do contribute to its dissemination, and we did contribute to its content. And indeed, UNESCO's logo is on it as a partner. It's the second such publication that we've been working on with that we worked on with the IHRA. And allow me to pause here just to acknowledge the leadership role of the IHRA in this respect on Holocaust distortion, but also on Holocaust remembrance and research and education in general, and also to really pay tribute to the outstanding chairmanship of Germany in 2020 and through 2021. And we, as UNESCO, also took part. Indeed, we are taking part in this social media campaign, Protect the Facts, because we indeed think that distortion, in particular, in its online form, so to say, is a major issue to be dealt with at the moment. One reason for that, besides our involvement on Holocaust education, is that UNESCO is the UN agency in charge of protecting freedom of expression, and therefore we have a mandate to address the problem of hate speech and disinformation. It's also the agency in charge of media and information literacy, how to help people critically evaluate information with which they engage and which they may share. So for us, the issue of Holocaust distortion is also seen in this broader context, and it is particularly important. And we think that we can indeed bring particular expertise in that respect. And I would say even that in this context, Holocaust distortion is somehow to Holocaust denial what disinformation is to hate speech. And it is, in my view, the reflection, and that's what Katharina was just saying, in fact, of a larger issue whereby hate groups and governments distorts the facts, whereby they falsify history in such ways that it may serve their present political purposes. And they do so by instilling doubts about academic knowledge, here in that case, the Holocaust, or spreading alternative facts that may just be total lies. Or they shed light on one aspect of history while obfuscating the big picture. These are all these strategies that are being used by hate groups, but also by governments. And this may not always, when it comes to Holocaust denial, be intentionally anti-Semitic. While Holocaust denial is systematically anti-Semitic, it's its very nature. But Holocaust distortion creates an environment that is conducive to anti-Semitism, racism, and all of the forms of prejudice. So that is why, because of that particular context, and the issue of anti-Semitism in this context, that UNESCO has developed a social media campaign, another one, also with the European Commission, called Think Before Sharing. So it was with the European Commission and Twitter to inform the public about how conspiracy theories function, how to debunk them, how anti-Semitism may play a role in the overall context of conspiracy theories. And now we're developing an educator's guide on this basis, on the basis of the infographics that we prepared for the Think Before Sharing campaign. We've also launched a study on Holocaust distortion and denial on social media, together with the Oxford Internet Institute, with the support of the World Jewish Congress. The idea here is to identify, to analyze the main trends, the sources, the rationales, the channels, the types of groups that are distorting and denying the Holocaust in at least the English, the French, and the Spanish languages. We might do more. And more importantly, this will lead to the development of specific materials, also for educators, policymakers, but also for social media platforms. I will just finish by saying that what is important in that respect is not only regulation aspect that Katharina referred to, but it's also to be able to develop counter-speech. The UNESCO's idea is the free flow of information, and therefore that more speech is better in general than less speech. And that our role as international bodies, as experts, is also to be able to provide better access to quality information. So following that rationale, UNESCO and the World Jewish Congress have worked together with Facebook to make sure that when you make a search in your Facebook on the Holocaust, even if it's an ill-intentioned search, such you will click Holocaust, for instance, the search leads you directly to a website that we have created together with the World Jewish Congress that is called aboutholocaust.org, that exists now in 19 languages. This website contains very simple, basic, but historically sound information about the Holocaust. If you want to know more, the different facts contained in this website lead you to the Encyclopedia of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So now when you're on Facebook, you look for Holocaust, this is what you find immediately, even if you look for Holocaust denial, anti-Semitic content. So this, in our view, is the kind of enterprise that we should also do with when it comes to working with social media companies.
Thank you very much, Karel, for that. And you all have a lot of homework to do, everyone watching. You have to check out everynamecounts.org, againstHolocaustDistortion.org, aboutholocaust.org, as well as the hashtags protect the facts and think before sharing. I think that already kind of shows how many opportunities there are out there to really engage constructively on the topic. Daniel, as I come to you, and as we're slowly coming to the end of our first panel, let me kind of connect this question of challenges to the question of working positively to highlight Jewish life today. So all of you on the panel are actually overseeing the fight against anti-Semitism in your institutions, but I think there is a positive momentum to kind of turn that around and speak to how are we protecting and fostering Jewish life. So perhaps you could speak to how that looks like in the Council of Europe, and how can we use remembrance in a current day effort to safeguard Jewish life.
Thank you very much. My mandate actually is on hate speech and hate crimes against Jewish citizens. It explicitly does not cover promotion of Jewish life, although we understand ourselves as an organization which should guarantee that Jewish life and Jewish culture will always have its rightful place in Europe. And this was emphasized by our former Secretary General several years ago, when there was an attempt to curb at least traditions, certain religious traditions, Jewish traditions, which we obviously contested very clearly. But let me come back to one aspect which is important to me, and I'll be very short, which is public discourse and hate speech. Now, that is very much a concern of mine and a concern of the Council of Europe. So I would like to recall an incident some years ago in 2017, when a leading member of Germany's AfD populist party called into question Germany's established cultural tradition or culture of remembrance. It's actually a German word that doesn't exist so much in English. Erinnerungskultur, so the culture of remembrance. And we thought that was outrageous. And so it's important to intervene very, very quickly when one hears these sort of relativist tendencies. So we did intervene, and we saw it as a scandalous attempt to undermine the memory of the Holocaust. Now, we have talked about legislation, and we have talked about soft law and guidelines. Perhaps just one important fact that the European Court of Human Rights, which is part of the Council of Europe, has established many things, and one has to be very careful. Of course, everything is a case by case. Every case has to be examined on its own merits. But one thing is clear and has been established, that Holocaust denial is not covered by freedom of expression as protected by Article 10 of the Convention. So it's very rare that you can make a very clear statement about what a court will say or has said. It's clear that Holocaust denial is illegal in Europe. Coming to hate speech, two aspects. Again, we are preparing a recommendation on a comprehensive approach to addressing hate speech, which will take into account the case law of the human rights courts, as well as other international standards, and of course the legal work of the European Union as well. So this should be finalized by the end of the year. I'm very interested, and perhaps this is a discussion which I can have with the members, or we can have later on the aspect of content moderation of the big internet platforms. And I would like to point out that some NGOs rightfully complain that many platform providers don't take down anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and anti-LGBTI messages fast enough to stop them from spreading. And they also complain, and this is something that I'm interested in, that the way in which platforms moderate content is not transparent, and it's not clear. The rules are not clear. Katharina mentioned algorithms. Of course, that's sort of self-censorship in a way. But I think the current thinking is that big platforms should always take down, obviously, manifestly illegal content, and also content which is harmful, which has been reported by users. And obviously all the platforms have functions for this, but the way in which they do it is worth discussing, and I think merits more transparency. And that would be my final point on hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it's become an incredibly frontal conversation, I think, in the Jewish community, among Jewish NGOs, and among institutional partners. So on one side, it's great to see that this is moving forward, but there's so much to be done. I think the Digital Services Act is a great example, and it will be interesting to see the extent to which other bodies are able to kind of model according to that. Christy, let me come to you now. Tell us a little bit about, kind of going back to this idea of how do we take remembrance as a tool as well for tackling today's challenges, tackling anti-Semitism, but also what you were alluding to a little bit earlier, building positive Jewish life.
Sure. So maybe just to kind of sum up, I think the more information that we get that feeds into our annual hate crime report, the more accurate information we get from participating states that we can put in our Holocaust Remembrance publication. It shares good practices and good ideas for not only governments, but also civil society organizations and Jewish communities to be able to learn from these good practices is crucially important. And then finally, on coalition building, I would say, This is one of the best ways that that our community can strengthen our own efforts to address anti-Semitism that Jewish communities face. But of course, we're seeing some of these same tactics applied to other communities with the Black Lives Matter movement now addressing these issues. The Roma and Sinti communities have faced many of the similar types of discrimination and intolerance for many, many, many years. The LGBTQI community, of course, faces a significant number of hate crimes. And so when all of these communities work together to advocate and to strengthen each other's efforts to say that none of this is okay, none of it is acceptable, to hold their governments to account, to say that they expect the governments to fulfill their responsibilities to address these issues, they can be far more successful than any one community can do on their own. And so I really appreciate the work that you've done and the work that you've supported of other communities that are facing similar types of issues to collaborate on these very troublesome issues. And hopefully we will see that moving forward, that this will definitely be addressed and that we'll learn from each other in these practices.
Thank you, Christy. And I think our intention when speaking of cooperation in this particular context was this interinstitutional cooperation that we've seen more of on your end. But I think the civil society cooperation is at least equally important. So thank you for highlighting that. And Carol, in coming to you, your portfolio is located within the Division for Peace and Sustainable Development. That's already sort of a positive and affirming framing. So to what extent do you feel that your work for remembrance is able to be conductive to safeguarding Jewish life, promoting Jewish life in a positive way? Just if I can ask you for just a few short thoughts, as I'm a bit conscious of time.
Yes, indeed, it's a very broad framework, and we think this is helpful in this respect. I mentioned earlier that we're working in the framework of global citizenship education, and this is a priority for the UN. It's a core concept of Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education, and so the idea is that all the principles that we apply to our work on anti-Semitism and on Jewish history is that it contributes to nurturing a sense of belonging to a common humanity. This is really the basis of global citizenship education, and at the same time that it promotes the values and the skills for gender equality, social justice, human rights. And there are a number of programs in this respect that sort of follow this overall trend, including our program on anti-Semitism. The issue of, I would say Jewish issues in general also contained somehow in our work relating to intercultural dialogue. It happens occasionally that governments turn to us on Jewish history when they want to integrate such elements in their work. So for us, it's very important to have this broad educational context in which we set a number of principles, general principles that are universally valid. And at the same time, within this broad framework, we deal with the issue of anti-Semitism in particular as such, with its own ethos, its own nature, and therefore that it is dealt with not as only as a general human rights issue, but also in its particular manifestation, that it's understood for what it is. So we're looking always at finding a balance between the very large human rights, global citizenship education oriented frameworks, and at the same time dealing with anti-Semitism as such. And indeed, it does raise a lot of interest, I would say. And I'm going to finish on that. Together with the ODIHR in 2019, you should know we've trained people from ministries of education, 64 countries. And that shows also that this kind of approach has validity, even in countries where you have no Jews or very little to do with the history of Jews and with the history of anti-Semitism. 64 countries from all regions of the world were represented in our training work.
Thank you, Karel, for highlighting that. And I think also this important point of balancing what is universal and what is specific, and making sure we have a focus that touches on both. And Katharina, last but certainly not least, coming to you, you know, your portfolio was initially called Coordinator for Combating Anti-Semitism, and then the bit of fostering Jewish life was added to that. And I think that already kind of shows the mindset shift. So tell us just as a closing thought, perhaps, what that has looked like in practice and how this shift has translated to action on the ground.
Yes, so the addition came with the new president, Ursula von der Leyen, coming into office in December 2019. And I believe it had become clear already in the 4 years before that, you know, our, I mean, often I got a remark from Jewish communities, you know, don't just talk about dead Jews. It's only about dead Jews, you know. It's Holocaust remembrance, nobody has a problem. And when it's to commemorate a terrorist attack, okay. But, you know, really we want this positive aspect. And so our focus really is very much in seeing how we can support Jewish communities in their diversity, and let's say to allow also a normality of Jewish life. And we are not naive. We know it takes time to uproot the barriers that there are in order for Jewish communities to be able to fully benefit of all their rights, let's say, and also make life decisions without having to think, for example, of security issues all the time. I know that also the Jewish communities with whom we work, I mean, they would prefer to just be able to say, we are having a meeting at this and this place, and please come. And that is currently not possible. One concrete issue, because it still starts with security, has been that we launched a call, the Director General for Home Affairs last year, to support the security of places of worship, and to ensure that Jewish communities thereby feel safer, and thereby also can use the funds that otherwise sometimes have to go into security for other purposes, for their community life. We will, in the next funding round, also specifically, and this is starting next year, specifically look at how we can support, for example, young youth organizations, the exchange also between the intercultural dialogue between different organizations, ensuring that the Jewish voice is heard in different contexts. And all of this is now under development, but we definitely, the fact that we shift towards the positive aspects. And after all, also the fact that, some of the smaller communities cannot sustain themselves because still as a late repercussion from the Holocaust, is also one important aspect to say it is also Europe's responsibility to ensure this diversity and this Jewish life, including the different institutions that are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina, and thank you to all four of you for joining us today, but more importantly, really for the crucial work that you're doing within your institutions. And I think an informed audience about that work is an important part of its effectiveness. So I am glad you could join us today to share what some of that work actually looks like. This concludes our first panel. Thank you to all four of you for joining us. Please stay with us, as in a moment we'll be joined by four wonderful speakers representing four very different initiatives, which we think are illustrative of the innovative work that is being done on the ground level. So we'll be with them in just a second. All right. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for your patience as well. We're having this conversation at the same time that we're confronted with some worrying statistics. We've heard some of them on the previous panel. 1 in 20 Europeans never heard of the Holocaust. 1 in 3 say that the Holocaust is a distraction from other atrocities. 1 in 2 Europeans say Holocaust denial is a problem in their countries. And so it's wonderful to have the four of you today with us, because I think you're all making important contributions to actually making these statistics much better. And I'm glad that we'll have the chance to speak about four very diverse and important initiatives that will give all of those watching a glimpse into just the range of tools and approaches that are out there to improve work on Holocaust remembrance, education, and research. So thank you for your patience once again, as we've had a small delay. Ilan, I'll pass over to you to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you to our second panel for all joining us. Welcome, and I'll quickly introduce you. As Alina mentioned, we're pleased to have with us today Reto Speck, co-director of IHRA, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, Father Patrick Desbois, founder and president of Yachad Inenum, Edward Sirota, director of Centropa, and Anna Mirga Kryzelnicka, I hope I pronounced that okay, deputy director of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. And we're pleased to be able to create a little bit of synergy, so to speak, with Roma voices and gain perspectives of work done around elevating remembrance of the Roma Holocaust as well. To begin with, we'd love it if you would just introduce to our viewers each of your initiatives, and particularly to the work that you do around Holocaust remembrance, education and research, and your sense about how this work comes to fill quite a unique gap, I think. Reto, let me start with you. Tell us a bit about the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, perhaps to begin with.
Yes, of course. And first of all, many thanks to Binay Burić for organising this wonderful and very timely event, and for also, of course, kindly giving me the opportunity to speak. As Ilan already said, in this panel, I'm representing the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, or ERI for short. And ERI is essentially a consortium of 25 archives and research institutions from 15 European countries, plus 2 international partners. So these are Yad Vashem in Israel and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC. And ERI has been around for a while now, so we have been active since 2010, so more than 10 years, with funding provided by the European Union. Maybe the fundamental problem that ERI is trying to address is the wide dispersal of Holocaust sources across the globe. And just to give you an indication of the scale of the problem we are facing, ERI has so far identified more than 2,200 archival institutions that hold Holocaust documentation, and these institutions are located in 59 countries. So I guess what you can easily see, what these numbers demonstrate is how difficult Holocaust research can be. So even for quite a small scale project, a researcher has to go through the collection catalogues of dozens or even hundreds of archives. And then that is just to locate the sources. And then once he or she has done that, accessing them is of course even more difficult. And now if you scale that up to a large scale project, say, looking at the Holocaust from a transnational perspective, you can easily see how difficult that soon becomes. So IHRA addresses this problem in a number of ways. Maybe most importantly, we have developed the IHRA online portal, which gives online access to information about all known Holocaust archives. So in the portal, you find information about all these 2,200 institutions, as well as about the hundreds of thousands of archival units that these institutions actually hold. But a lot of the Holocaust archives, of course, have never been digitized. So IHRA also offers a fellowship scheme, which essentially grants travel stipends to researchers so that they can physically access the most important archives that they need for their work. We then also host a lot of training events, so both virtually and in person, and we also organize a lot of events, workshops, and so on for the for knowledge transfer and for discussion. You ask, Ilan, what is unique about IHRA, I guess, in the sort of the constellation that we have today. And I would say what is unique is really our transnational focus. So everything we do is geared towards making sure that borders are always continuously crossed in Holocaust research. As I already said, we do that, for instance, through the virtual integration of Holocaust sources, by enabling researchers to travel, and then by creating a lot of opportunities for international collaboration between researchers and archivists, and by the sharing of knowledge across the border. And I think this transnational focus of IHRA is very much based on the recognition that the Holocaust was, of course, a European or maybe even a global phenomenon. And also because of that, because of the enormous geographic scope of the crime, that it can never be understood from purely local or national perspective, but that we need to have an equally wide perspective. And maybe just a last word, if I may. The event today is, of course, about Holocaust remembrance rather than Holocaust research and archives, which is what IHRA is mostly concerned about. But at IHRA, we very firmly believe that all three are very closely connected. So for us, it is clear that meaningful Holocaust remembrance must always be based on high quality, state-of-the-art research. And of course, Holocaust research is critically dependent on access to archival sources. So there's a very clear connection in that. And I'm looking forward to the discussion we're having today, where we maybe can explore some of these connections and how they work together.
Thank you very much, Reto, and for speaking to IHRA's resource pooling and transnational approach that you mentioned. It's a great connection from our first panel as well for some of the challenges that they highlighted. Father Debois, let me come to you now. Your work on genocide and as well on interfaith cooperation is quite powerful and broad as you speak out and fight against human rights abuses in various contexts. Today we're focusing on Yachad Inanum, so tell us in short about the important work of the organization of which you are a founder of.
So since 16 years, we have a team, we are 29 full-time in Paris, in Brussels too. And we have interviewed more than 8,000 non-Jews present at the shooting against the Jews from Lithuania to Azerbaijan. And so, and we have crisscrossed this interview with the archives to establish evidence, because we think that the biggest problem is that we cannot say Jews have been killed if we cannot prove the crime. And so these testimonies have been digitalized. The archives also, it's accessible across an interactive map. It's complicated also because we cannot disclose completely the testimonies because some witnesses are involved in the crimes, of course. We have done the same duty with the Roma. We have a Roma team and we have interviewed more than 400 Roma survivors from Romania, Moldavia, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. We have found also 70 extermination sites of Roma. I must say that it's completely under-evaluated. There are only 2 sites with a stone, and all of the other sites have no stone and nothing. So I say that because we have different challenges. The first challenge is that now people feel far away from Holocaust, know nothing. And we think that to teach microhistory of crime, including the responsibility of the killer, the name of the killer, where he was from, etc., Otherwise, we are the temptation to teach the machine was killing the Jews. And for the Roma, it's another challenge, is that people don't care when you kill Roma, and they don't care to protect the mass grave, they don't care to teach what happened. And so we are really to fight strongly against the public opinion, and also to bring evidence, because the hate against Roma is so strong in Europe today and yesterday and tomorrow will be the same. So it's what we did. We have found the 2,700 extermination sites of Jews, and as I told you, 70 extermination sites of Roma. And what we feel the biggest challenge is that year after year, the young generation are far away from Holocaust, don't know anything, and are not really receptive to receive the big story of Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and that and that. And we think more than to teach the crime as it happened in a village is much more accessible for a young person, because they have a lot of reality show, I would say, or fiction who are about criminology. And so this generation is sensitive to that. The other challenge, as you said, is that new generation also are always asking why you don't teach the actual mass crimes. We drive actually the same investigation about the Yazidi with the same methodology, the same interviews and the same archives. And I think we have also to be aware of the legacy of Hitler. In front of us, there are people who know nothing about the Roma and the Jews, but they know about Hitler. They don't know Stalin, they don't know Mao. Hitler made his name. And so I never saw a country where you have to introduce Hitler. So I think we have to be conscious that in front of us, we have people completely on the other side teaching the legacy of Hitler with stronger than ever, from ultra-right to radical Muslims. So that's a different challenge. But my main point is that we have found more than 2,700 crimes done by somebody. And to reestablish the responsibility of the guy seems to me important, because I see that sometimes when people speak about Auschwitz, they speak about the machine, but we don't know who was the guard, what's his name, what his age, at what time he was working, where was the office of Mengele, which time he was working, where. We know nothing about that. And so I'm afraid that we optimize too much the capacity of young generation to swallow this big history of the Third Reich, of the rise of anti-Semitism, of the killings machine, etc. And I think it's more easy actually to teach the crime, to identify them with victims, killers, or neighbors, or collaborators, etc. That will be my sum up.
Thank you, Father Tebouan, for speaking about the detail-orientated approach of Yachad Dinenum. Very much appreciate that. And now going into the direction of arts, photography and storytelling, Edward, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Saint-Tropez.
I will do my best. It's an honor to be here, and I thank everyone concerned. I've been long, it's an admiration, Father Desbois, of the great work that you've done. My jaw has often been on the floor, and incredibly impressed with what you've done. I will see if I can share my screen to tell you a story with some slides, and I may not, but I'll give it a try. And if not, I'll just have to revert to storytelling, which I guess I'll have to do. Hold on one second. Sorry. I couldn't make my slideshow work, so I'll paint pictures with stories. My work in this part of the world as an American started in the mid-1980s in Romania, when I was in a cemetery in Dorohoi, as it turned out to be. And I went through the 16th century, or the 17th century graves, and the 19th century graves, and then the 20th century graves, and then I found myself standing in a cornfield. there were no more Jews. It was typical of this part of the world is that the cemetery had run out of Jews. The good news is that most of the Jews from there were not murdered during the Holocaust. They had left after the Second World War, but the point was is they had planned for a future, and then they gave the caretaker the rest of this empty cemetery to use as a garden. And I thought how utterly sad that is that we could be losing this part of Europe's heritage, Jewish heritage, which I'll come to Katharina von Schnurbein's point about the cemeteries mapping project, because there's a real educational component in that as well. I photographed Central and Eastern Europe, Jews in Central and Eastern Europe for 15 years between 1985 and 2000. In 2000, I stopped taking pictures of Jews and started taking pictures from Jews. And what I mean by that is that I was making a film for ABC News in America, Nightline, and it was about a Jewish old age home in Romania, in Arad. And I was going home with elderly people there, and they were sitting in their apartments, and they were showing me their family pictures, and they were telling me stories. And I went, who collects this stuff? The answer is nobody. And working with some brilliant young historians in Hungary and in Serbia, members of the Jewish community and children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, we set about interviewing people, not so much about how their families were murdered during the Holocaust, that was part of it, but how they lived before and after. And we ended up with a database of over 1,200 interviews that we conducted in 15 countries. We digitized and got stories about 25,000 family pictures and documents, and we've made them available in a searchable online database. 270,000 people come to this database every year now. Now, aside from that, preserving Jewish memory, our goal was to disseminate our findings to the widest possible audience. And what we did with that, and this was kind of funny, when we went online in 2003, we had no intention of going into education. But you can't trust teachers, because teachers started going to the website and they started asking us, well, can I do this with your database? Can I do that with your database? I found that fascinating. And I come from a marketing background from years ago, and one of the things you learn is listen to your customers. And I asked teachers, what do you like about this? And they had one word: stories. It's all about stories. And Centropa became a story generating machine. First, we collected them from people, wonderful stories. And then what we did is we turned those into multimedia films, which are short, usually between 3 minutes to 30 minutes. They've been in 19 film festivals. And then we started working with teachers to help us build programs that they could use. I know we heard from Carol and from others before this, from people from ODIHR, of how to set a structure on top and work downwards through organizations. Also, Reto's organization to provide a database so that people can dig into this stuff. Centropa is a very practical, grassroots, down-to-earth organization. We go into the schoolrooms. I need to see what teenagers create with the databases that we make, with the films that we make. When I can get kids to be doing things, then I know that they've learned something. I'm going to keep my remarks short. The last thing I'll say is something interesting is we're always surprised. If you stay open source, you will be, which I guess Reto, you certainly must know more than most people. And what we've done is we were asked by this EC-funded project called the European Jewish Cemeteries Initiative, the ESJF, to work with them because they were mapping cemeteries. Well, all over, whether you're talking about Poland or Serbia, Croatia or Lithuania, you have these Jewish cemeteries in every town. And we're not talking about the monumental work that Father Dubois has done with the mass cemetery, the mass graves of mapping them off. I'm talking about the local Jewish cemetery that every town and village has. And we started running educational seminars on the weekends in these cemeteries, and we couldn't keep the teachers away. They were so curious. They said, oh, finally, somebody can tell me what to do with this stuff. So they're making rubbings, they're making scrapings, and then we're bringing historians in for them to learn how they can teach the Jewish history of their town. Then we hold competitions for teenagers so the kids can produce projects that they can be proud of and share with each other. This is our way of working with teachers and students, and we appreciate all the support that we get from, especially from any donors who might be listening today, and I haven't thanked, but we appreciate everything that we do get, and we welcome the cooperation with anyone who's listening. Thank you.
And thank you, Edward, for your comments there. Certainly, even without a presentation, created a very visual representation in our minds, I'm sure, of the work that you're doing at Centropa. Anna, certainly last but not least, tell us about the remembrance work of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. And as well, you're welcome to touch on some of the other initiatives that you've been involved in, such as Dikna Bista around Holocaust Memorial Day as well.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting us and having here also a space to hear some of the Roma and Sinti perspectives. I listened with great interest the previous panel and also the presentations of my colleagues here, and I just have this overwhelming sense of how important this work is and how much more of the challenges that you already outlined, which are severe and acute, how much more and much more severe they are also in the case of Sinti and Roma. So in our case, as I guess is no secret here, upholding the memory of the Holocaust and of the Roma victims of the Holocaust and advancing with the practices of memorialization or commemoration has been really in the hands of the Roma for a very long period of time. Just to illustrate here, and maybe I will mention here maybe one of the initiatives that you mentioned, Ilan, is there is the initiative of the Dikna Bista, which is Look and Don't Remember, Look and Don't Forget, an initiative led by Roma youth that has started in 2010. The initiative aimed at bringing together Roma and non-Roma from all over Europe to Krakow and to Auschwitz to learn the history firsthand and to try to create a coalition. The first initiative happened in 2010, and just to give you an idea, the first Roma memorial to the victims of Holocaust in Germany was created in 2012. So that just only shows you how very much behind we are in the work of Roma Holocaust remembrance. This has very many different ramifications and consequences. One is that the Roma Holocaust is not part of the historical canon of what we learn in schools. The Council of Europe and Roma Education Fund, together with the George Eckert Institute, just recently published a study that looked into textbooks in Europe, studying over 850 textbook items, and they found that Roma are not represented or they are misrepresented in the canon of history and education, formal education that we have throughout Europe. So this is where it's really important to have in mind that the road for Roma Holocaust remembrance is very long. And in this context, maybe I'll just say a few words about who we are as ERIAC and what we're trying to do. There's so many initiatives and so many thoughts on my mind I'd love to share with you, but I'll try to be brief. So ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, is the first transnational institution that aims at fighting for the recognition of Roma history, identity, and culture throughout Europe. We are created in 2017 with the support of the Council of Europe, the Open Society Foundations, and the Alliance for the European Roma Institute. And we have this unique and single mandate of trying to bring together Roma and non-Roma institutions and individuals that work through arts, history, and culture to fight against anti-Gypsyism. And we are a membership-based organization currently with over 150 members in 4 thematic sections. One of the sections is history and commemoration, and quite honestly, the Holocaust remembrance is very much at the heart of most of what we do. What's unique about ERIAC, outside of this broader mandate that we have, I think that in the context of what we talked about is two aspects. One is that we work at the intersection of different fields and different domains of activity. So we work with research and education, we work with arts and culture, and we work with commemoration and institutional practices. So trying to engage somehow cultural diplomacy to try to advance with Roma Holocaust commemoration. And here, this intersection is crucial because we can allow to bring together different partners and different initiatives under one platform. Since we are a membership-based organization, we also bring different institutions and organizations and individuals that have experience and expertise in this field. So this allows us to create a bigger momentum and a shared agenda to advance with Roma Holocaust commemoration specifically. And one thing that maybe I would highlight also here is that many of the challenges that were mentioned with regards to research, the institutions, the different spaces or connection to space of the histories that we talk about. This, of course, is very important for our work as well. One of the priorities that we see now is trying to connect the Roma Holocaust history with space and with specific locations. So what Father Dubois has mentioned here, of course, this is exactly the case. There are so many sites of Roma Holocaust that are continuing to be without any plaques, without any types of commemoration. Many of them remain completely unknown. One of the most famous cases to mention here is the Lety Upisku campsite in Czech Republic, which until very recently was a pig farm. And it was only through a very assertive work of Roma civil society and its allies that finally the pig farm has been removed, and now there is an unraveling process of building a memorial in that place. But that only shows you that there is really so much work to write Roma into the history of Europe, into the history of our local smaller towns, to really understand that Roma have been and continue to be part of Europe. Maybe I'll stop here. I have many ideas and specific examples, but I'd also love to engage in maybe in a more dynamic discussion rather than a lecture. So I'm looking forward to your contributions and comments.
Thank you so much, Anna, and it was wonderful to hear from you and from all four of you about really the amazing work that you're doing. And while listening to you, I think a lot of synergies actually become quite evident. I do want to move towards the space of challenges, and I think most of you already mentioned quite a lot of them, perhaps except for Edward. So perhaps I will start with you on this question. You know, on the previous panel, we spoke of distortion online, revisionism, politicization. Now we spoke of, you know, this sense of distance that exists between, you know, the history and the current day and so on. But I wonder, in your work, which is so kind of full of life in a sense and focused on life, what have been some of the challenges you've experienced, particularly in this specific period, the pandemic, the recent few years, and how have you been able to kind of overcome them in a creative way that speaks to how remembrance might look like moving forward?
Well, we all know that this time for teachers and students has been just murderous, and that teachers are having to often teach their classes while sitting at their own kitchen table, minding their own families and preparing food and still teaching themselves. Children, it's awful for children, teenagers. They need that social interaction. So we certainly, our hats are tipped to them, truly. The challenges that we've had is, one of the funny things is when as I mentioned before, is this, which surprised us, was how many teachers really wanted to learn about how to use a Jewish cemetery in their classes. This came out of nowhere. We expected no one, and yet it's been very exciting for us to see how many teachers wanted to take part. The challenges that we've had, of course, are teachers are overwhelmed, and it's very hard to get your project, our project, in front of a teacher, because the teacher then has to get it in front of their students, and that's not easy these days. Everybody's overworked, everybody's stressed, and even kids very often spend more time learning online than they did when they were in school, but it doesn't make it easier for them. There's one thing that we have learned, and it's been working fairly well, is that there's one word that affects the teenage brain more than almost anything else, and it's the word competition. If a teenager thinks that he or she is in a competition with other kids, for whatever reason, it validates a kid. They love being in competitions. They will go so far as to actually learn something if they're in a competition. And they like making projects. And if we do projects that they, let's say, have to do a project on my town's Jewish history, that they have to use online resources or go outside and if they're allowed to go outside, to take pictures and then create something in PowerPoint or make a video, it gives them a chance to share that with others, and that works. But it is a challenge to get programs across to teachers and students today. And also the other challenge is that when we do put on a seminar, as we just did in my colleague Fabian Rula just put in a program in Krakow back in August, we would allow for 30 teachers in a very socially distanced, before the last set of lockdowns, but more than 100 and something teachers wanted to come. So the challenge is we had to deny 2/3 of them, but a third did come. And now, of course, the problem and the challenge is to follow up. We've got to find out what they do learn. And I think that summarizes what I need to say.
That seems like a pretty good problem to have, too many participants. But Edward, I maybe particularly take this note about that it's been difficult to keep remembrance and the idea of promoting Jewish life as a priority during this pandemic period where there was already so much going on. And so I think the question we can ask ourselves is, how do we make sure that this is constantly a priority, because it's such a, I think, starting point for education more broadly. Since we're on this topic of youth, perhaps Father Debois, I will come to you, since you were speaking about this challenge of kind of bringing the past to life for young people and breaking through this idea of a machine and making both perpetrators and bystanders be individual people. And I know how impactful a trip that you organized with UGF, the French Union of Jewish Students, to Ukraine was. So I know that you are having a lot of success in actually overcoming these challenges, but perhaps you can speak a little bit more to this, to how you've managed to kind of break through these challenges that you identified through potential other examples beyond this one.
Thank you. So yes, we must understand that for the new generation, I teach also in Washington, in Georgetown University, and you must understand that for the young people, 18 years old, it's no more the story of grandpa, but grandpa. So it's far away. So it disappears from the trauma, from the feeling with the victims. You know, don't forget that they were selling Anne Frank uniform in eBay, that some people make a selfie in front of Arbeitsmarktfrei, a selfie on the Juden ramp. And if we don't take that in account, if we say, oh, it's a deviation, but guys, we don't understand who is the young people today. And so I see in Georgetown, I was teaching already 7 years ago. 7 years ago, they knew more or less what was Holocaust. Today, they know nothing, even the Jews. A little bit, they know Auschwitz and Hitler, and that's it. And so I think we have a big challenge, and me also, I take in account that the country who deny the Holocaust are huge territory. When I begin my course, I always ask how many countries don't teach Holocaust in high school. how many countries don't teach the genocide of Roma in high school? And you will have sometimes 80% of the planet. So we have two choices. Either we gather together, we say, hey, we are strong, we'll teach again, but Jews have been killed in Europe because we are European and American and Australian. Okay, but the rest of the planet is connected also through internet and through anything. And so it's why I prefer to teach the enigma of every crime. I give an example for a crime against the Roma in Alexandrovskoye, it's in Russia. They killed 400 Roma and in a city which is completely isolated. It was a cold cause. It took us 8 days to establish how the German could do that. We found 3 witnesses. I prefer to say neighbors and witnesses, but bystanders, because they are not bystanders, they are still in the village, they never moved. And so when you want to teach that, okay, you show the map of the country, village, you see where were living the Roma, where from came the German, where they parked their car. So you rebuild cold case. And after, if possible, we propose to the students a travel on the ground. And each year we bring a lot of people on the ground. My students in Georgetown, they have to make a field trip every spring break, 8 days, not 1 day, 8 days, and to meet the witnesses until they are alive. And you know, when suddenly they meet a man who was a guard in a camp, one day in Poland, they met a guy, there were a lot of mass graves, and one Polish man, he said, in this mass grave there are babies, Jewish babies. And my group asked the man, how do you know there are babies? He said, because I put them myself. So it changed completely because it's a criminal travel. It's not a story, it's not, and so they can investigate themselves. And in many cases also, a new witness appears that we never met before. So they feel like investigators, so they will feel that they have the evidence in their hands. You must know, in a travel on the ground, every morning I show them the piece of archives concerning the place where we go, but I don't say what happened in that village. They will have to discover it. And when they discover it, my gosh, it's a changing life experience. I see for the Roma also, we went in a village in Kabalovka, in Ukraine, where they killed so many Roma. We had to bring a survivor from Romania there and to confront the survivor to the local people of today, and everything has been videotaped. When you show that to people, suddenly a survivor, Roma, who comes back in a village where his family has been killed, where the family have been burned, buried, suddenly it's a criminal story. Me, what I am afraid is that we teach Holocaust like a big machine, was like an epidemic. We killed a lot of Jews, a lot of gypsies, a lot of communists. It was not an epidemic. Everybody has been killed by somebody. Even in Auschwitz, it was not a machine. It was a human being who was closing the door of the gas chamber. It was another human being putting the Zyklon Bay. And we don't know the name. By example, for the Roma, who killed the Roma? What is the list of the names? And if suddenly you reveal the list of the killers, you establish responsibility. Because, you know, the young generation, they have the question, what can I do today? And if they understand the challenge of yesterday, humanly speaking, they can affront the challenge of today. Because today, if you want to help against anti-Semitism, against terrorism, against hate against Roma, it's the same. You have to confront who did what. By example, we did also with our team of Roma an investigation against the criminal hate against Roma today in the suburb of Paris. It took us 5 days with hidden camera to find what happened and to make a statement. Because I think also we must help the new generation understand that the last Jew killed was not killed in 1945. Many Jews have been killed after. And the last Roma killed was not killed in 1945. A lot of Roma have been assassinated since that. And there is a continuity in hate crimes. So it's difficult for us because it's really a big changing way of teaching, because we have the temptation to make what many museums do, rise of anti-Semitism, election of Hitler, etc., etc., etc. But for a young guy, it's too much, and it's grandpa. You know, one guy, one day in America say, oh, I understand the gas chamber, but you know, father, we have no gas chamber in America. And that was finished. It was no more his question. But if you begin to say it was a German who denounced the people. It's a German who took this family of Jews or Gypsy in this village. What was his name? Or he was from Romania. What was his name? Etc., etc. You reestablish the crime with a human dimension. I'm afraid we take out the local human responsibility in teaching Holocaust. We speak only about the victims, the big machine, and after bystander, upstander. Okay, but it didn't work like that. It didn't work like that. And today, when you want to kill a Jew or to kill a Gypsy, it's the same machine. It's a human machine. As I say to people, when a Jew is killed in France, we don't look in which camp he is. We are looking for who killed him. And if a Gypsy has been assassinated, it's the same. So we have to reestablish this criminal history. But I'm so happy that Hanna Mirga Kruchelnika is here because my team told me they know you and you are a well-known person in the Roma militants.
Thank you, Father Debois, and I will go to Anna on this note, because I think both Edward and Father Debois spoke to, the challenge of engaging youth, making things relevant for young people. But at the same time, we see, Anna, that particularly in the They Cannot Be Stir initiative, it's really a youth-led initiative where young people kind of take responsibility and find relevance and are the main actors there. So, I think it's just a great opportunity to hear a little bit from you how you think that came about. What are the learning points from that? How can that be replicated or broadened? And generally, I'd love for you if you could highlight some other kind of positive stories and step forward as well in this area of cultural diplomacy and intersectional work with other groups as well.
Thank you. And I would just like to say, first of all, a huge thank you, Father Dubois, for all of the work that you've been doing. It's been really very crucial, all the over 15 years of work of trying to collect and document and to raise awareness around Roma Holocaust history. And I'm very grateful. And many of the points that Father Dubois made here resonate very, very strongly with the work that we do. And specifically on the note of the youth, I think in general, the experience of going to the place, going to the site, and then maybe facing history through the voice of a victim or a perpetrator is an extremely emotional and sometimes even a life-changing event. But in the case of Roma, I think that impact is even bigger. That's because many of us, Roma, growing up in schools, didn't really learn much about this. And the history of the massacres that happened also were kept sometimes a secret in the families themselves or in the communities themselves too. So for the idea of bringing young Roma and their non-Roma peers to Auschwitz, which is the symbol of the Holocaust horrors, and then discovering through the voices of Roma victims and Roma survivors, how this actually developed, has become such a relevant experience for all the young people that went through this, that they themselves then became the voices that carried it out. Those memories, the Roma Holocaust commemoration to their own communities, and then many times actually also asking about their own communities, their own grandparents, their neighbors, and many times also asking about other periods of history or other geographies. For example, we had many people coming from Spain who formally did not form part of the the kind of axis of influence of Hitler and the World War II, but they still started to ask what happened during the Spanish Civil War. So this somehow awakened a certain request of why is it that we don't know this in schools? Why is it that the teachers don't say this to us? Why is it that it had to be until middle of 80s that Germany really recognized its responsibility for the Roma Holocaust? So I think this type of work is really very relevant. This is I think one of the very few effective ways of really trying to confront the youth with the history face to face instead of just reading it through textbooks or something like this. Another important thing that also resonates strongly with what Father Dubois mentioned is the question of trying to take the story, the history, the large history into very specific smaller stories of what has happened. And in the case of Roma, you can see this very well because it's mostly about Roma victims, and it's always told as if that was like an anonymous whole, an anonymous community. You don't learn about the names of the people, how big were the families, what were their life before the Holocaust. So this is really something that we're now trying to restore by pointing to stories of specific people. And more specifically, there is a very big trend nowadays of Roma resistance. So inspired in an uprising in the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp in 1944, the day of 16th of May when the uprising happened, now this day has become a day of militancy and also of recovering those stories of individuals, of Roma individuals who have contributed not only to trying to fight for freedom of their own families and communities, but also to the broader struggles in their countries. And ERIAC has been now developing a project financed by the FVZ Foundation about rethinking Roma resistance, trying to look back into different geographies and different sites to see how Roma individuals, both men and women, have demonstrated bravery and heroism, many times through also saving others. Just 2 days ago, Alfreda Markowska, Noncia, a Roma Holocaust survivor from Poland, just passed away. She was she saved over 50 Roma and Jewish children during the war, and she is not a very well-known persona. This is where we step in and try to work somehow in this way. And just a final comment on this, and I think this is very important, is the power of the counter narratives, and particularly how we can use arts and culture to evoke emotions. So I think that what's very clear, especially nowadays, is that the attention span is short, long textbooks, not necessarily of great interest to the youngest generation. So we need to find different ways through which we can build emotions and somehow build a connection or empathy towards what have happened. And in the case of the Roma Holocaust, there is a lot of memories and actually all our oral histories and the very stories of the past that are encapsulated in arts and culture. Whether this is through poetry, whether it's through songs that have been passed from generation to generation, whether it's through film and theater, we are now seeing that these are very powerful tools to try to evoke emotions and somehow build a momentum to understand that Holocaust is not an isolated event. It did not come out of nowhere. There is a historical continuum of anti-Gypsyism and of racism towards people that we consider as unwanted guests, whoever they may be in different periods of time. And we need to understand that there are signals that we can recognize when the situation is getting worse, and there are ways in which we have to confront it. And arts and culture in this context provides a very unique platform for beginning to ask those questions and also trying somehow to mitigate, to create a counter narrative to the hate and the misrepresentation of communities, particularly Roma, but also Jews, that we see nowadays. So maybe I stop here and I'd like to let others speak.
Thank you so much, Anna. And coming to Reto, I think it's, I'm curious how you reflect on this contrast, because Edward, Anna, Father Debois, the methodology for the three of them is kind of make things as human-centered as possible, tell individual stories. Whereas I imagine with research that's somewhat different, if not the opposite. So I'm wondering how you kind of reflect on this individual approach, how it informs your work, perhaps, but also do tell us about how your research work may have been shifting in the recent few years, and particularly throughout the pandemic, and how you kind of had to adapt to that.
Sure. Thank you, Alina. First of all, I mean, it was fascinating for me to hear from all three other panelists, because as you rightly say, Alina, we kind of come from slightly different perspectives, both in terms of what our focus is, but I think also in terms of approach. There's a bit of the difference between the very much grassroots bottom-up, and ours is maybe slightly more institutionalized and top down. But if I may, because I was just thinking about, what are sort of the main challenges from our particular point of view with regards to the future of Holocaust remembrance. I thought about the pandemic and how that has changed things for us. And I think two very interesting things were revealed during the pandemic, and they're not new, but they were just put into very sharp focus, I think, over the last year. And the first one is what we have seen over the last few months is really a very substantial, dramatic increase in usage of the IHRA online portal. So that's our digital infrastructure by which people can access sources. So that has gone through the roof. And that's, of course, a very nice thing. And among other things, it also indicates that, despite the pandemic, Holocaust has kept on progressing, right? People can still do work because so many things that we can do at the moment can be done online. But at the same time, we, of course, had to suspend our fellowship program because of travel restrictions. And as I tried to explain in the beginning, we used that program to give people access to those very important sources that are non-digitized. So what we have seen through the pandemic is essentially that non-digitized sources on the Holocaust have essentially become inaccessible to research, right? So that's the effect of it. And of course, the pandemic will pass. Well, let's hope it will. But I think the sort of the general trend that we're seeing, that what doesn't exist online doesn't exist, that will continue. And I think here we have a very important problem or an important challenge, first of all, for Holocaust research, but I think, by implication also for Holocaust commemoration, which is how can you fix that? How can we sort of start to address that digital divide? So you have some sources that are available digitally, are widely used. You have others that become more and more hidden simply because they're not available online. And of course, that's not a random division. You have institutions that are very well funded, that have a lot of resources, they can digitize the sources. You have others that cannot. And I think that's really an area where we have to put a lot of effort in. We really have to get to the situation that we can put all relevant documents online, and we have to be able to do that relatively quickly. I think that's really important because it's in many ways it's not a technical question or a technical problem. Ultimately it's an ethical one, because ultimately, if we continue on the path we are on at the moment, that more and more of our lives and our activities are happening on the internet, ultimately this question, which voices, which sources on the Holocaust will still be heard in the future increasingly, and which ones will not. So I think for me, it's the importance of digitization, it's the importance of putting things online that is very essential. And that's of course not to say, that we should forget about physical interaction, about physical access to sources. Of course not. But at the same time, I really think we have to think carefully about the kind of divides that are created in the online world.
Thank you very much, Reto, for your response. And indeed, you come on to a question that I really want to ask, is sort of giving the space for a final thought as well, and that is looking to the future. All panelists, you've mentioned a number of challenges that we're up against. Reto, you speak about the digitalization of research information. Anna and Father Dubois, you've spoken about this paradigm of the transgenerational transmission of trauma, I guess, and how we can create emotive emotive responses to education on Holocaust when it goes beyond 2 generations, perhaps. And as I say, we've spoken about a number of these challenges, and I would ask, how do we see remembrance going forward for our panelists? How do we keep the memory alive as fewer and fewer generations of survivors are with us? And what do you think is needed? How can, as well, perhaps, Reto, and coming to you first, you can maybe reflect on how audience members can be a part of remembrance, or providing a final thought on what you think the future of remembrance would look like. And as I say, Reto, if we start with you, and then we can sort of go through our panelists, next to Edward, to Anna, and then to Father Debois.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think, we have heard it many times in this panel, and especially in the panel before as well, that we have two really worrying trends going on at the moment, don't we? So on the one hand, knowledge about the Holocaust is declining, and it's declining rather fast. And secondly, Holocaust denial and distortion are on the rise. And I think all of us are extremely worried about the confluence of these two trends. So I think, what is clear to me, if you want to safeguard meaningful Holocaust remembrance, we clearly have to reverse both these two trends, right? Otherwise, this is not going to happen. And it's also obvious to me that a renewed focus on Holocaust education is extremely important for that. At the same time, what we also have to do, we have to counter online misinformation by making high quality, properly curated content available online. I think these two things are hugely important. And I think we have already heard in the previous panel, a lot of really great initiatives that try to make that happen. I also think, talking from the point of view of IHRA and Holocaust archives, it seems clear to me that we are important in that context, right? So, ultimately, archival sources are some of the best weapons that we have to expose misinformation and to debunk it. And as I tried to say before, I think we have to take these weapons to where the war is being waged, and that is the internet. I think that's very important. But in a way, I don't think that it is going to be enough that we simply feed people quality information about the Holocaust. I think what we also need to do, and I think it was addressed in the first panel very briefly by Karel, I think we really have to address the growing information illiteracy within society. My experience and my view is, and other people might have more experience in that field, but my kind of view is that often people fall for misinformation, not because they lack access to quality information, but simply because they lack the critical skill to separate fact from fiction, right? They just are not equipped with the kind of skills they need to, to critically assess information, to verify it, to look at its provenance, to analyze it properly. And I think that is, if you think about Holocaust education and what you should focus on in Holocaust education, I think that's really, really very important. So we not only have to focus on content, of course, we have to keep on teaching kids that 6 million Jews were killed in Auschwitz. And of course, that is important. But, chances are sooner or later, they will come across information somewhere in the internet that the gas chambers were just some kind of elaborate hoax. And so they will then have to decide what to believe. And I think we have to help them to decide wisely, right? And I think we do that by thinking about critical methods in Holocaust education. Now, again, in IHRA, being a consortium of the biggest Holocaust archives and research institutions, we of course have, a lot of expertise, methodological expertise on how you critically read historical information. And I think that is an area where we could and should do more in the future. So to make sure that sort of these critical methods are not only properly applied in Holocaust research, which is what we have been focusing on, but also that they feed through to education programs more widely. And I think that would be an important, that's not the answer to the big question, but I think it would be an important contribution to it.
Thank you, Reto. And Edward, over to you for your reflection.
You are muted, Edward, if you could unmute yourself.
I agree with everything that Reto said very well. And I'll try to say this in as few words as possible. When we say education, that's, we, for those of us who work in schools, have to realize how little teachers are paid, how much they're expected to work, and how much they're expected to shove into a year's worth of teaching and to match their curriculum. And that's hard. We work with teachers in Macedonia that earn in a month what a teacher earns in Germany in a week. And they're expected to teach. In regards to what we do at Centropa, there's several things that we find are extremely important. And we also we work in small towns in South Carolina, North Carolina, in East Los Angeles. So we want to make sure that we have content that a teenager can find the me in the story. And that's and to us, it's extremely important. One of the things we want to make sure is that we want them to see how Jews lived, not only how they died. If you're only teaching Holocaust, then we had a teacher and we had a museum director in Orlando, Florida, who said that he was using videos for his kids who came in where they got to watch videos of 3-minute disembodied heads talking about being murdered. And he said that I've got to be able to do something more with kids. You have to turn students, and if you want to look at Europe's future, and now we're talking about in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, where Father Dubois did such excellent work. I'm talking about the high schools we work in there, and in Moldova, and in Lithuania as well. What you want the kids to do is to create projects where they feel that the history of their town's Jewish history, their town's Jewish history belongs to them, that it is not what the people did to the Jews. When you do that, you've lost your battle. You have to, when you've got the brilliant work that Father Dubois has done and others, and by the way, and I have a project that I'll tell you about, is when the kids become stakeholders and feel proud of their town's history, then suddenly anti-Semitism is on the outside. When the Jewish history of my town is my history, then they say, what kind of schmuck would do this? And then you put them on our side. Now, what we've done, by the way, Anna, just to briefly, is that we have programs in Hungary where we have kids in Roma schools in Eastern Hungary, working with the most elite schools in Budapest, where the idea is they have to make videos together on Jewish folk music. And of course, if you want the Jewish kids to learn really how to play great music, bring the Roma kids in. And they have a fabulous time comparing notes. And I'll send you a link of Shola Kokoshmar, When the Rooster Crows, where we've had 15 applications where a school in Budapest and a school in Eastern Hungary made the projects together. Again, it's making kids the stakeholders. And we do this, I think that we can get somewhere. And when they feel that there was a Jewish life and they run around and they're making videos of where Jews lived in my town and what they did and going through archives, they're going to learn in a lot of ways. So I'm not, as you can tell, all that pessimistic. If we work hard, and it takes a lot of work on our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, for your optimistic reflection there. Very much appreciated. Anna, same question to you.
Well, learning, ERIEC is based in Berlin, even though we're an international organization based here in Germany, and that allows us also to reflect a lot on Germany's history and how it has also dealt with its own past. And one of the takeaways we have is that when Germany was, trying to educate their very anti-Semitic society after the war, they used a threefold strategy. One was the laws, of course. So, anti-Semitism or hate speech or what type of violence is forbidden. The other one was education, which both included formal and non-formal educational approaches to try to kind of de-learn and then learn a new content to a society that has been completely traumatized and where the hate has been so deeply rooted. And the third point is arts and culture. And indeed, here in Germany, during that period, a lot of literature, theater, film was produced to try to use this as a tool to kind of help the society reflect on what has happened and try to build new connection and kind of a new way forward. And this is why I think that institutions in this sense are extremely important. And the Council of Europe has just recently here this past summer approved a recommendation, a historical recommendation that urges its member states to include Roma history, culture, and identity in school curricula. Hopefully, this is going to happen, at least for our community. It's going to have some make some change, but also, there's such an important work to fight hate speech and misinformation online. I won't go into details here because this was discussed very much so in the previous panel, but I really believe that this is absolutely crucial. But institutions are not enough. I think it's very important that we also involve communities, especially the victim communities, in the work that we do. And it's so important to be able to speak and narrate this in first person. And in the case of Roma, this is absolutely essential because there is so much misrepresentation and because there is so much speaking about Roma as as kind of the outsiders. So there needs to be tools and venues and institutions that promote counter narratives and allow people to understand this history that seems so far away as something that's actually, that you can connect to, that you can kind of, place yourself in somebody else's shoes. And this is also why it's so important that we bring it back to the territory. So of course, so much talk about online, especially now in the pandemic kind of reality, but we need to make sure that we need to bring this home to people. It needs to be local histories. It needs to be connected to specific spaces, to specific artifacts. And I think, especially now, the pandemic showed us that there's many different ways of trying to connect the online with the offline. And there's a lot of initiatives, very interesting initiatives that we're considering about how we can imagine involving AI, and virtual reality to try to kind of cross over and take advantage of these technological advances that we have, to try to bring this also closer, especially to the youth, who is the most detached and for whom this might be somehow attractive. And we should not shy away from using pop culture, from using comics, from maybe making gamified experiences to sneak very much historical and factual content to the kids. And finally, what I think is extremely important is building coalitions. And from speaking on behalf of coming from the Roma community as I come, and speaking from the voice of a powerless person, where there's so many obstacles of the majority society. It is so much more crucial that we build spaces where we can come together. And it's not about competing victims and competing realities. It's about really a peaceful, sustainable future for all of us. And the coalition building should not only happen across countries and across ethnic identities or religions. It should also happen across institutions and domains, across research and the game world and the high art and the pop culture. We really need to come together. And not on today's opportunity is absolutely outstanding, but we should find more opportunities like this to work in a sustainable way and to provide each other support and a platform and a voice. So I hope that this is just one of many discussions that we'll have. And from here, I'd like to thank very much for inviting us and extend an invitation also to join ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, and learn about what we do and how we try to find creative ways to make the most of what the resources that we have and somehow come together and face these challenges together. So we'd love to collaborate with all of you long term and hope for many occasions like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks for your participation today, and as well with your closing thoughts. Father Debois, I'll come to you finally again to provide your thoughts on what the future of Holocaust remembrance and education going forward looks like.
For me, I don't like to speak about the future of memory because it's terrible. What you will say your son and your grandson if you already speak like that? I think we have to raise the question, why to teach Holocaust today? Why to teach the genocide of Roma today? We have to heal the planet. The disease is not dead. It's like epidemic, the virus who kills the Jews and the Gypsy in Auschwitz or in a killing field is not dead. People are still hating the Jews and the Roma. And so I think we have to teach against hate. We are not in front of people who deny the genocide, don't love the Jews. They hate the Jews and they hate the Roma. And so I see also a big challenge how to find money to translate everything in English. Because in the next generation, who will speak Polish and Romanian and Russian and Romanes and nobody. So otherwise it will be a small group of researchers who have access to that, even if it's online. If it's a lady speaking Romanian, who will understand from Russia. And so it's a big challenge because we can accept it or not, but English is the key language all over the world. And secondly, I agree, we have to come back to the ground. I always insist, do we accept that hundreds of mass graves are not protected like if it was not human beings? Why we protect Auschwitz? Why we don't protect the mass graves? Is it acceptable that one man, he told me one day, I have 1,500 Jews in my garden and nobody came back. I know places with 300, 400 Roma. Is it acceptable in modern Europe? Because if we accept that, if it was nothing to bury Romas or Jews in your garden, why is it important to kill one Jew or one Roma today? So I think there are different challenges, but to come back to the ground, to protect the mass grave and to educate around the mass grave in the elementary school, because hate is coming at this level. People don't like the Jews or don't like the Roma since they are children, because they have been trained like that, but they can be trained in another way if we work on it. So that will be but to translate everything in English and to protect the mass grave for me as a big, if we protect only 2 mass grave of Gypsy for 70 extermination sites, how you can speak of dignity of Gypsy? It's very easy. We speak like if the dead have been buried, but they are not buried. So we have to come back and, it's a very sad reality, but it is, and it is in the middle of Europe. In Moldavia, you will not find a memorial. And so many Gypsy and Jews have been killed. So that's I don't want to be long because I know everybody is tired, but when you are on the ground, you see the big gap between when we speak between academic and when you are in a village. Nobody cares. The animals are on the mass grave. Many people extract the gold teeth to sell them in dark market, and after you come back in amphitheater to speak of memory. We have to bridge, I think, the people who are strong thinkers, but also people who have money, because if we don't translate in English now, who will do it in the next 20 years? Nobody.
Thank you, Father Dubois. And I think if you, as a French person, are making a call for English translations, it's already a good indication that it's an important initiative. But all kidding aside, I want to just summarize kind of some of the future-oriented points that you made. First of all, confronting people with mass graves, particularly young people, allowing them to confront that reality, making remembrance relevant for today, building coalitions, importantly, involving communities, involving children and making histories their own, and as well information literacy. I think coming from very different perspectives, all these kind of action points fit very well together and complement each other at the end of the day. As we close, I'd like to invite everyone watching to follow all these amazing organizations and initiatives on social media, on their websites, IHRA, ERIAC, Yahadin Unum, and Centropa. They're all incredible initiatives. I'm sure that as you've heard from all our 4 speakers today, you already got a great sense of that. Thank you for sharing some of your great work with us today. And I hope you only go from strength to strength in that.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone watching. And we hope to see you soon on some of our next programs.